So today I will be talking about Carl Nielsen's Wind Quintet Opus 43. In order to understand any piece of music better, it's always a good idea to get to know the past of the composer, in this case Carl Nielsen. So Nielsen was born in Denmark, in a small region of the country in the island of Fyn, and his childhood was for the most part very poor. He lived in this small cottage, and there were 12 children and 2 families that lived in the same cottage. So it was very packed, and they were very poor. So he did not have a lot of luxuries in his childhood, but his parents were very hard workers. His dad was a painter as well as a musician, and his mom loved singing. So he always had music throughout his life, and that's something that definitely influenced his life. So when he was a kid, he was taught music at his home by his dad, and he would often get to join his dad in his little get-togethers where they would play folk music, and eventually Carl Nielsen did join the military band of Odense, Denmark, and he played the bugle or signal horn or whatever you know it as well as the E-flat trombone or alto trombone. So he worked there for a little bit, and he made some money, and he used most of that money to pay for himself to take lessons. So it's kind of a sad story in a way. You know, he really was trying to go into music since he was a kid, and he was very dedicated, and he paid with that money he paid for his piano lessons, and he played violin, and he was playing like Mozart quintets or Mozart string quartets with people, and really trying to keep up with music, which eventually took him to join the Danish Conservatory of Music, in which he kind of realized that he was looking at music in a different direction than most people during this time. The tradition in that school was very much Scandinavian, romantic, and they really didn't want to move on from that, while he was more of a guy that wanted to explore the future and not get so stuck in the past. So he really he wasn't exactly the most excited student when it came to repertoire that the orchestra was playing, because he always felt like they were just lacking modernism in that school. So by the time he got out of school, though, he started exploring modernism, and yes, definitely ahead of his time when it came to those things. So by the time he wrote this Wind Quintet, this was much later in his life. He was actually in his mid-50s, and he was on a phone call with a friend, and he overheard the Copenhagen Wind Quintet rehearsing in the background, and he was like, "What is that?" And went over to their house and was listening to them rehearse, and was just so inspired by this instrumentation and people and he was so excited that he was like, "I want to write a piece for you guys, a wind quintet." And they worked together, and not only did he want to write this wind quintet, but he even promised them that afterwards he would write a concerto for each player of the quintet, which unfortunately didn't happen, because by the time he wrote the flute concerto and the clarinet concerto, he was not in good health, and he wasn't able to write the rest. But we are lucky enough to have at least two concertos by him for the wind quintet players. So so in his wind quintet, we can kind of see this neoclassical style that Carl Nielsen had. And neoclassical meaning he was utilizing inspiration from the past, yet not necessarily stuck with classical form. So we can kind of hear this in his Wind Quintet. So here's the very beginning of the first movement. this is the Berlin Phil Wind Quintet. So we've got Berlin Phil members playing here. Okay, so we can kind of hear how this is kind of going away from classical form into something else. And another really interesting thing about this piece is actually the beginning of the second movement. In his second movement, he gives the clarinet player the melody. And as we can hear, the melody is very gorgeous. It's very beautiful. It sounds very tonal, like a classical piece would sound. So, a bassoon here is accompanying. The more I listen to this melody, I honestly think of his childhood and how it sounds so beautiful, like the village that he lived in the island of Finn, and just a peaceful background. Yeah, so this is definitely a moment in which we can really truly confirm his love for classicism and looking at the past, yet putting it in a modern form. Now it's the flute and oboe melody. But yeah, he sneaks in, like, within this these classical moments, some moments of modernism, chromaticism, and things like that. Okay, so another cool thing about his piece is, while he was writing the Wind Quintet, he also was wanting to implement the players' personalities into the music. So in his third movement, which is a set of variations, he's trying to depict the personality of the clarinet player and the bassoon player. Okay, so let's hear a little bit. So as we can hear, the clarinet player sounds very much angry and crazy, while the bassoon player is just kind of being mocking and kind of funny at the whole situation. They're kind of fighting, and the bassoon has the last word. Which in real life, the bassoonist from the quintet was a really funny person and was very joyful and always was a jokester, and the clarinetist was just kind of like had a very strong personality. And so it's important when a wind quintet plays this piece that we're thinking about these things, that we're thinking about what Nielsen was thinking about when he wrote it, and why he wrote it. So some things to keep in mind when playing a piece like this is the instrumentation of a wind quintet, which is flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and horn. And as we can see, they are very, very different. They're very different instruments. It's not like a string quartet where you've got two violins, a viola, and a cello, and they all have strings. They're all very similar. And I'm not saying that it's easy for them, unlike us, but it does give you a little bit of a plus when they're all playing very similar instruments. Meanwhile, in the wind quintet setting, we've got flute, which is a very high instrument, and then oboe can be pretty high too, but the timbre is just so different. Then the clarinet is a lot more subtle, can play a lot quieter. Clarinet uses a reed, a single reed, oboe uses a double reed. Then we've got bassoon, which is also a double reed instrument but plays a lot lower. And then a horn, which is a brass instrument. So we're just dealing with a lot of different timbres of sound, which is very different than a string quartet. Also, we deal with other problems that maybe other ensembles may not, which is intonation difference, intonation tendencies. For example, When you've got a clarinet tapering something really quiet, they're going to tend to get sharp. Meanwhile, on the flute, we're going to tend to go real flat. If we're tapering something, we're getting quieter. So when you put those two things together, it's going to not sound pretty. So you have to work those things out and understand the different instruments' intonation tendencies in order for a wind quintet to work. Same thing with volume. The French horn is going to tend to be a louder instrument because they're a brass player. So you know they're going to have to be conscious of that when rehearsing and playing with the other players, because it's very easy for a horn to overpower the entire quintet. Then of course we've got oboe and flute, and they're just such different instruments. It's very tricky with intonation because they're going to be very close together in terms of registers. So it's important to try to blend, etc., etc. There's a lot of things that we need to work out in a rehearsal. Also, articulation is huge. If me as a flute player, it's very easy for me to play very short if the music says to play staccato. Meanwhile, for a clarinet player, that's just going to be a lot more difficult because of just the way the instrument works. So they're going to tend to play a little bit more legato. So it's important to meet somewhere in the middle. Flute player plays a little bit longer, clarinet plays a little bit shorter, and then we finally have a sound that molds together. So yeah, those are just a few things that is important to keep in mind when playing in a wind quintet, and a piece such as the Nielsen Wind Quintet. So I hope you enjoy this presentation, and I hope that you have a good rest of your week. Thank you.